really happy to be here with you, getting ready to study 1 Peter for the next 8 weeks. My name is Dr. Ruth Anne Reese, and I have been working on and studying the text of 1 Peter for over 20 years now. And I'm really happy to get a chance to share it with you in the time that we'll have together. Let's dive in right away. Our first week, we're working on 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. But before we start on the text itself, we need a little bit of background in order to help us understand where the text is coming from and where it's directed to. And so I want to begin that work by talking with you about the author, the audience, the setting, and the purpose for the letter. This letter was written by Peter. Peter was an apostle of Jesus, and at the time that he was writing this letter, he was most likely in Rome, and it was most likely that he was beginning to experience persecution. In AD 65, there was a fire in Rome, and the Christians who were living in Rome were accused of starting that fire, and in response to that, they began to experience persecution. So Peter, he was actually a Jewish Christian. He was living in Rome. He would be a minority person living in a culture that was very different from the culture that he knew and that he was familiar with. In other words, he himself was what we might call a resident alien who was living in a land that he was not familiar with. He is writing to a group of people that he refers to as the chosen, people who have been chosen by God and who are also described as resident aliens. These people live in a place called Asia Minor. Asia Minor is our current day Turkey. So if you're familiar with where Turkey is on the map, that is what Asia Minor is. And to give you a sense about the size of Asia Minor is about the size of Texas. So it's a big place. And Peter's writing to churches that are scattered throughout that area. Now remember, this letter's pretty early, about 65, 66 AD. And so because it's early like that, there probably aren't a lot of big Christian churches. Instead, he's writing this letter to little groups of people who are scattered over a big area, an area the size of Texas. He's going to give this letter to a letter carrier, and that person is going to be walking from place to place to place, delivering this letter to these communities. The other thing we know about these communities is that they also, like Peter, had begun to experience suffering because of their faith. The suffering that's talked about in Peter is not just any old suffering, the suffering that you have because you got sick or because somebody died. It's specifically suffering or trials that happen because of faith in Jesus. And Peter is writing to that group of people. He writes to them with a particular purpose. At the end of the book, in chapter 5, he talks about writing a letter to them for the purpose of encouraging them. So as we think about this letter, one of the things that we want to think about over and over again is, how are the words that I'm reading in this letter, in what way would they have been encouraging to an audience that was experiencing suffering because of their faith? In addition to suffering, though, Peter also indicates that the normal experience that they should have is the experience of rejoicing in their faith. In other words, even though they're suffering, suffering is not actually determining who they are. Instead, in this opening section of the book, verses 1 through 12, we find that God is giving them a new experience. And the new experience that they're having is the experience of being born again and being created into the family of God. As people who are part of the family of God, they are people who will receive an unfading inheritance, an inheritance that's stored up for them in heaven. They are people who are experiencing the hope of the resurrection, and they are people who are experiencing the gift of salvation. We can think about salvation here as being that experience of deliverance or healing, right? Salvation has an extensive kind of sense about it. and they get to experience this. Now remember that Peter's writing to a group of people who are resident aliens, people who are different from the culture that's around them. So how did they become different? Most people think that this group of people that is being addressed were Gentiles, just like their neighbors, and that they became followers of Jesus. And by becoming followers of Jesus, they took on a new identity. And that new identity made them different from the people that they had grown up with, the people that they lived among, the people that they conducted their daily business among. And because of that, they had now become alien from the culture that they originally knew. So this group of people that Peter is addressing, they're different from the culture that surrounds them. And they've become different because of their choice to follow Jesus. One of the things that I think is so crucial about the metaphor, the family of God, which is going to be the predominant metaphor in 1 Peter, what I think is so crucial about that is that these people may have left their family. They may have become alienated from the people around them. And what God gives them is a new place to belong, a place where they can experience security and safety, a place where they can experience belonging. And one of the things that I think is so crucial about the family metaphor in 1 Peter is that it meets the very need that the people that are being addressed have. Their need is to have a place where they're not alien, a place where they're not exiles. And what God gives to them is that place, and that place is the family. So he doesn't talk about the church. Instead, he talks about the family of God. So the last thing I want to do is talk just a little bit more about the geography of Asia Minor. So I mentioned earlier that this is a large place, but I think it's also important to know that there's a diversity of kinds of places within Asia Minor. So for example, on the outer edge, what would be the western piece of Turkey today, is the ocean. And this would have been an area where there was a lot of trade, a lot of commerce, a lot of going back and forth between, say, Rome and Asia Minor and Jerusalem, Asia Minor and Egypt, a lot of trade and commerce in those areas. And there were big, well-known cities in those areas that had received benefits from Caesar, from the Roman government. In the interior, there's a plain that goes up from the ocean, a large, extensive plain. And on that plain would have been smaller villages. It would have been more agricultural. There would have been more farming and raising of olives and raising of vineyards and those kinds of things. So two different kinds of experiences even within this area. And so one of the things to realize is that we refer to 1 Peter as a general epistle. And the reason we call it a general epistle is because it's addressed to a large group of people who are scattered over a large region. It's not addressed to just one church in one place, but instead addressed to a lot of different gatherings of Christians who are spread over this region. I hope that you enjoy your study this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.